What up, Mr. Josh? What's up?
Good afternoon. How we doing?
I'm doing all right, man. It's another day. I'm thinking we'll start on page 11. We'll start with this map.
Gotcha.
We'll do that like a
I saw um, your your photo of you when you were a youngin.
yeah, man. It's back. I think I was like 16 or 17
that
back in the day, man. Back in the day.
that that's wild.
It's back in the day, man. It's back when I was playing football and life was simple. You know, life was simple back then. Life was simple. Before I had to start reading candles, it's a good time. Can you hear me? All right, groovy. Let me get that off the screen. Hey, Miss Simmons. It's my favorite teacher. It's my favorite teacher, yeah, Miss Simmons. All right, so Mr. Josh, right here we have a map of U.S. territories. I'm wondering if some people can drop the names of these U.S. territories. I think we got the Louisiana Purchase in here somewhere. Louisiana Territory. We got the Oregon Territory in here somewhere. We got some former Spanish territory in here. Feel free to drop it in, guys. We'll treat this like a do now. See the original 13 colonies. See Ohio River Valley in here. Feel free to identify a territory if you see one. See one, name one. So, Mr. Josh, this one in the middle here, Louisiana Territory, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Purchased that from France.
Yep.
Napoleon sold it to us for a very, very economical price. One of the important reasons was because we needed that port of New Orleans. A lot of this territory hadn't been explored yet, but we needed that port of New Orleans to help us trade. Do you see one you recognize?
Well, I know that the one in the bottom right, the tiny one, that is the state of Florida. So that's a pretty easy one to see.
State of Florida, former Spanish territory. Former Spanish territory, which we talked about how we have cultural influences in different parts of the country. Part of the reason why we have such a strong influence is not just immigration, but Florida was an original Spanish territory. Let's see. Up here we got the Oregon Territory. All right, I believe that was originally British, and it was part of Canada and Vancouver. The United States felt it had a natural claim to that territory and was already settling it. So we ended up acquiring the Oregon Territory. What about that one below it?
So the one below it, we actually talked about that one in class. That one, when we fought Mexico in the Mexican-American War, that is part of the land that we took from them. But there are some states in there that we ended up creating, such as California on the coast, Nevada, Arizona, and I think maybe a bit of Utah in there as well.
All right. Now down here we have the annexation of Texas, right? We actually annexed Texas twice. We had the Battle of the Alamo. That was an important part of that. Glad somebody remembers the lesson. All right, we were teaching, but very important territory. Speaking of taking territory from Mexico, so could we argue the whole Southwest was actually taken from Mexico, Mr. Josh?
I believe we could. When we talked about westward expansion last week and the classes before, those two areas, Texas and the area with California and Arizona, were originally part of Mexico. The Mexican government allowed Americans, the white settlers, to come into those areas and kind of become the people that live there. Once the Mexican government lost those wars, those Americans asked to be part of a larger American country because they had connections there, both economically and culturally.
All right. Last territory, we had the original 13 colonies, and it's mixed with the Ohio River Valley territory that we later acquired in the French and Indian War. Want to elaborate on that, any, Mr. Josh?
No, I think that's it. Remember, with the Ohio territory, we originally, no one was there. And when they opened it up to settle, a lot of people moved in and started actually the push west. Once cities were founded or made, then those areas became the points where people started to move out west with Manifest Destiny.
Oh, I hit a button. Don't know what I did with that. That's weird. Oh, okay. That's strange. Don't know how to get rid of it. Figure it out later. All right. So we're on page 11 here. We're on page 11. Yo, anybody know how to get rid of that? No? All right. Oh, well. All right. Let's look at page 11. Excuse me, down to page 12. Supporting question 3, day 4. All right. Over the next 2 days, resources and complete a graphic organizer. You'll be begin by examining the role economics and technology played in westward expansion. Sources E, excerpts of Western expansion, economics and technology. After reviewing source E, you may begin completing the graphic organizer that follows. Source background. In source C, you read 2 short excerpts from John L. O'Sullivan and President James Polk that helped you to define the term manifest destiny. After you examine some of the key events that allowed the United States to expand westward, source D below is made up of additional excerpts that provide us historical information about the economic and technological changes from this same time period as you read each excerpt. Annotate the text considering how the information relates to manifest destiny, and consider the types of people who are winning and losing based on the information presented. Okay, so we're just continuing with the theme of westward expansion, looking at it through the lens of economics and technology. We know that economics has to do with money, very important. When we talk about economics, we talk about economy, we're talking about the finances, so we're talking about the financial piece, and why that financial piece might have been important. Bam, I figured it out. I'm getting more techie every day, man. I'm actually have a real Instagram. All right, so let me read this first passage, Mr. Josh, and then we'll break some stuff down. The development of the cotton export sector depended on the appropriation, meaning control of Indian lands and the expansion of slavery. The major cotton-producing states, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, were carved out of Indian territory. Tribe after tribe in the South was forced to cede its lands, meaning give their lands up to the federal government and move west of the Mississippi River. 11 treaties of secession, meaning to give up land, were negotiated with these tribes between 1814 and 1824. From these agreements, the United States acquired millions of acres of land, including 1/5 of Mississippi and 3/4 of Alabama. Sales of Indian lands were followed by increases in the slave population in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and the slave population by increase in cotton production. All right. That's a mouthful. So according to this, the U.S. government paid Native Americans. To, I guess my question, Mr. Josh, did they was the payment a real payment? Is this really like a true statement, or is there more that has to be said about this?
So with this move of the Native Americans from where they had lived for hundreds of years to these new areas out west, um, the way that it was done was not very fair. It was not designed to be fair. No one thought it was going to be good for them. The idea was we will pay them, so we'll give them a little bit of money. And if they refuse, we'll just force them out. And this process of basically telling them, you will accept what we give you, and if you don't, we're going to do it anyway, became known as the Trail of Tears because of all of these native communities being moved out into new areas so that people could come in and, as we just read, set up plantations and start to create with some cotton and some other exports with slavery that they had also.
All right. So we talked pretty in depth about the Trail of Tears, if you guys remember. So what Mr. Josh is essentially saying is that, yeah, they paid the Native Americans, they promised them land, but they didn't have a choice. They had to move regardless. That's like somebody telling you, you got to get out of your house, and I'm gonna give you $100 to do it, even though your rent might be way more than $100, right? On top of that, Native Americans were not moved on desirable land. They didn't get to choose where they were moved to. The U.S. government would move them on the land that was least desirable. And the purpose for that was that the United States wanted to keep all the land that they could use to produce goods. So it was all about economics. And if you guys, I wish we were in class so we could talk about it more, but if you look at what's going on Native American reservations today, there are many, many reservations across the United States, Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, all over the United States. And a lot of the issues and challenges that the Native American people are having on their independent land has to do with the lack of resources on that land. Even something as simple as having running water that they can use for irrigation. So they were moved on to really destitute territory. So that's important to remember. So when you hear that they were paid to be moved, it was there's more to it.
Yeah, and if we look at the chart exactly. So if we talk, the text said that in Mississippi, a lot of the land there was taken from Native Americans and given to white settlers who brought slavery in. So we look at Mississippi in 1820. There's not a lot of activity there. There's not a lot of cotton, which means that there's not as much slavery. But once the Native Americans were pushed out, once the Native Americans left those areas and slavery came in and cotton production came in, it went from not a lot to a whole lot. That became one of the most effective and most producing areas of cotton in the entire country. So the land that the Native Americans were pushed off of, the land that they were forced from, was very good land. It was very good for growing crops. It was very good for having people grow in cities and towns. And we wanted to take it from them because we wanted to use it instead of them.
So key factor to pull out, as you see Native Americans being pushed westward on the Trail of Tears, you're seeing the African American population increase. Can you put that right back up for a second, Mr. Josh? You see the Native American population going west. You see the African American population increase because you see an increase in slavery. Because remember, the South was relying on free labor, right? They had to have someone work this land, and the best way for them to make that happen was to have free labor. Okay. And once again, when we talk about population centers today, when we think about populations in Atlanta, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, around New Orleans, part of the reason why we have such a deep population in these southern states versus somewhere like Massachusetts or Maine is because these are where African Americans originally were when we were brought over and enslaved. So those are things to think about. So let's move to the next section. I'll put mine back up, Mr. Josh. Any questions, make sure you guys drop them in the chat. We'll definitely pause and answer them. By the way, I'm not sure it's in here, but the cotton gin also was one of the major pieces of technology that increased the production of cotton and increased the need for slave labor. They were able to produce cotton more quickly. It separated the cotton from the seed. It was very, very efficient. So when that was created, it made slavery a even more robust trade, essentially, unfortunately. All right, so let's look at this next section here. By late 1848, the whole American nation and many foreign countries knew about the California gold rush. Many headed for California in the spring of 1849, either overland or by ship. Estimates suggest that between 5,000 and 6,000 wagons left Missouri in the spring of 1849. Others took overland routes that began farther south or even in Mexico. For the period of 1848 to 1850, lower bound estimates of overland migration are more than 101,000. Ships had also begun to leave New York and other cities on the Atlantic seaboard for California. Karen Clay and Randall Jones migrating the richest evidence from the California gold rush. So I want to pause for a second. I'm gonna leave this. I want to pause for a second, and I really have two questions. So you guys answer whichever one you can. What do we notice about population movement throughout history? We just talked about movements of population. What do we notice to be like the major cause of populations moving across the United States throughout history? That's something I want you guys to think about. I actually hold the second question until later. But what do you guys notice about the pattern of movement taking place? What's causing it? What is the cause of mass migration of African Americans, of Native Americans? And there's another group, when we talk about this California gold rush, that is going to become involved. Drop it in the chat. I know there's a lag, but drop it in the chat. What do we notice? What's the cause? Why do we have all these mass movements of people? What is the purpose? What's causing it? So, Mr. Josh, I would argue that economics are the primary cause of movement across the country. My evidence would be you had slavery taking place in the South and it increasing and moving African Americans to the South to participate in slavery because of economics. You move Native Americans west because of economics. Westward expansion itself was because of economics, right? It wasn't an overpopulation. It was people going to find their fortune. I would say we also move people of Mexican descent out of the Southwest American area for economic reasons so that white settlers could come in. Do you think that would be a reasonable way? Yeah, resources are going. Do you think that's a reasonable argument one can make that we could cite evidence for, Mr. Josh?
Yeah, I think definitely with African Americans, with a lot of the people that went to California to look for gold, the reason that they left where they grew up, the reason they left where they were born is because of money. They wanted to find better jobs, they wanted to get rich, or they wanted to escape an area that they didn't have any work in. So you see a lot of people come down south to be a part of slavery, whether that's forced as a slave or as someone who is a slave owner trying to make money off that. When we talk about westward expansion, people were making farms, people were being cowboys and cattle ranchers trying to make money there. And then when we talk about the gold rush, people flooded into California to start to see if they could find gold in the rivers and areas in California so they could get rich. A fun fact about some sports actually is that the San Francisco 49ers, the football team, takes their name from the gold rush because so many people came into that area in 1849 that it went from an area that had no people, no at least Americans or white people in that area, to a
And Mr.
super
Josh,
large area, concentrated people that became
me
a
a favor,
very
Mr.
big
Josh? Can you
city.
pull up a map of the U.S. territories really quickly? There's something else I want to touch on. When we look at westward expansion, I want you guys to keep in mind that when you moved west, you were moving on unsettled land. There were no cities. There was no, I'm going to go to the grocery store or I'm going to go to the shop or the farm, right? This is like essentially moving into the woods. Obviously, it's not all the woods. You got flat land out in the middle of America, but you're moving on completely unsettled territory. So think of the risk when you go from civilization, right? Mr. Josh, we're in civilization where I know I can go a certain number of miles and I can go buy milk at the store to literally having to feed yourself, having to survive yourself. This is truly unprecedented. Now, the types of people who went there, like you said, Mr. Josh, were people who were looking to make their fortune, but there was also a hint of, I'm not going to say the term desperation, but these were not individuals who were, let's say, wealthy on the East Coast, Mr. Josh. These were individuals who hadn't been able to claim land in those eastern territories, so were looking to go stake their claim on land in the West since it hadn't been settled yet. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. So the people that had made their money, if we want to look at this as the dividing line, the people that had made their money over here in the East, in the United States, they didn't need to go anywhere else because they were still making their money. The people that were poorer, the people that were looking for jobs or they were trying to make it big, started moving out west. But once you pass this line, once you pass basically the Mississippi area and the Missouri River, you leave civilization. As Mr. Pugh said, there are no more cities, there are no more towns. You can't really rely on other people. So once you go over here and start making it on your own, you're really on your own. You have to farm, you've got to hunt. If you get hurt or sick, you basically just got to pray. And it was a type of people that went there. Only a specific type of people went there because if you weren't strong enough or if you weren't prepared, you didn't make it. A lot of
Correct.
people.
Correct. Now, you had many people who took their entire families with them, right? And then you had people who went out, and a lot of people who went out west ended up, if they were not married, they ended up intermixing with different groups of people. So we do see some cultural differences even today when we go out west, go on the West Coast versus the East Coast because of some of those things that took place back then. So we'll touch more on that a little later. So let's see here. We got a map here, population of Western cities. So Denver is actually close to where I live. I used to live. I graduated from Colorado University. And look at the population. So originally the city of Denver was 2,603 people. From 1890, it went to 106,000. Omaha, Nebraska, 1883 to 140,000. Portland, 2,800 to 46,000. San Francisco, 56,000 to 298,000. That's over the course of 30 years, Mr. Josh. Back then, that's a pretty huge migration. And we can attribute that all to the gold rush, all to people going out west looking for their fortune.
Oh, yeah. And when we're talking about going from 2,000 people to 106,000 people, we're talking about more than 60. No, we're talking about 50 times more people than you had in the very beginning. So that would be like saying we go from 500,000 people in DC now to about 25 million people in DC over 30 years. So by the time you graduate college, you would have tens of millions of people in DC. That's how big of a boost we're talking in these areas. So you go from nothing to massive cities.
Great example. Now, the other thing I want to point out, and people don't think about this. I didn't really think about it until I spent a lot of time out west. When you go out west, you don't have the, how can I put this? You don't have the same amount of history as you do on the East Coast, right? If you go to Philadelphia, you go to DC, you go to Boston, you have these really, really old buildings. You have these really, really old sites, right? Of where the American Revolution took place, right? Like we have all these things. I could see George Washington's house. I actually went on a walk out in Accokeek, and I could see George Washington's house out in Mount Vernon from across the river. Like you have old history on the East Coast. When you go out west, you don't have that level of old history. And you guys will notice that I had a friend who came out here and was like, man, all the houses look so different and look so old. When you go out west, everything looks a lot newer if you're just looking at a overall case study, because people were migrating out west 200 to 300 years after people had first settled on the East Coast. So that's something to keep in mind. And I want you guys to think about that in regards to culture as you're learning about culture and why people are different in different regions of the United States. That's a big part of it. They never had slavery in California, which is why you might have California as being more of a liberal state. They weren't fighting in the Civil War. So that's just something to think about. I wanted to point out for you guys. So we
Yeah.
have a chart here. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Chris.
Yeah, like you said, a lot of these states are newer. They haven't had the time to develop those cultures or those histories. So when we talk about states on the West Coast, California, Oregon, um, uh,
Washington.
Washington, thank you, Idaho, all of these states, they didn't have slavery So the way that they interact with different groups changes. But the reason they didn't have slavery is because they only became states after the Civil War ended. So by the time they became states, by the time that they could and have more people there, slavery was over. They didn't have the chance to talk about it because we had already we weren't going to have that in any.
Yeah, and I think this is important to note when you talk about prejudice, right? Racism, prejudice, things of that nature. They develop typically from a culture and a history of behavior, right? So when you went out west, and I want to tie this into something we talked about earlier, when you went out west, you weren't as concerned with whether somebody was black or white because you were concerned with survival, right? So you saw a lot more, and we talked about the Buffalo Soldiers and how a lot of most of the original actual cowboys were black. So when you were out on the West Coast, it was more so about survival than it was race and prejudice and classism. So when you talk about liberalism on the West, and you talk about there being, let's say, less prejudice in certain areas of the country, there being more intermixing, it being more normalized in the West Coast, that's a big part of why. The way in which those states actually developed. I mean, California developed where you had Asian people, you had African Americans, you had white people, you had a lot of different people, whether it was the gold rush, whether it was to build a railroad, whether it was going west to get away from slavery, right? So we had all these, why people experience prejudice in a different way and why there's a history of prejudice in a different way, depending on what coast you're on. Okay, and it looks like we lost Mr. Josh, so hopefully he'll get back in here in a minute, guys. I wanted to show you guys a sign, right? So for California, direct, extraordinary, indexments 35 days to gold regions, steamship. So right here, we had an advertisement of them trying to get people to go west. An advertisement trying to get people to go west. Now I'm wondering, why might there be advertisements to get people to go west? Why might there be advertisements to get Americans to go west? Drop it in the chat. Why might they advertise for Americans to go west? Why would they want signs up? Drop your ideas in the chat. Hey, sorry, we lost that connection. So, Mr. Josh, I don't know if you heard me, but I was wondering, why would they have signs?
All good.
Why would they have signs getting people to go west, right? It says by steamship, you can go through Nicaragua, go to California, 35 days to the gold region. Why would they have signs to get people to move west? Why would that be a thing that would happen in America, right? Why would they be trying to get people to go west? And drop it in the chat,
So
guys. Why might they get people to go west? Drop it in the chat.
yeah, so if we're looking at these areas, remember 1849, they don't have phones, they can't send a message to the TV, they don't have that technology. So if they have gold there, or if they get jobs, exactly, someone saying get money, you need a way to tell people, hey, we have jobs over here, we have opportunity, we need you to come. So when they would talk to people back east on the East Coast, they would put out these ads. They would put out these basically job openings and would say, have ways to get you is if you want to work, come talk to us.
Right. Now, here's the thing. In order to complete manifest destiny and expand west, you need your population to move west, right? It's not just about claiming the territory. You need people to settle that land and actually live on it. Okay? So when they were trying to get people to go west, it was definitely having to do with, if I'm going to claim this territory, we need to have a population representing it, a population controlling it, right? We need to have a governor. We don't have a population. We can't control those western states. We can't control those territories. Now, on top of that, Mr. Josh, we talk about these resources. Well, if you're living on the East Coast and the East Coast is doing pretty well economically, in order to take advantage of the economy available in the West, you're going to need people to go out there, find gold, farm, all those different things. So there was a large incentive for the government, for people in power back then to get people to move west. That was important. They wanted people going west as often as they could. Sometimes they would incentivize it by saying they would give them free land. They could just claim a deed to whatever they wanted to. There were a lot of different things they used as an incentive for people to move west. And the gold rush obviously was an incentive of its own because we all know gold is worth money. All right. As the United States grew and developed, the telegraph to new towns in the West could stay in touch with their families in the East. News could travel across great distances instantly. Businesses also took advantage of this technology, this new technology. Businesses with branches, local technology could be used to transfer money between people and banks across the country. The increased speed and ease of communication played a significant role in helping the United States both grow and develop. All right. Losing people again. See if anybody's available today. Nope, people faking. I'm calling you. All right, y'all being shot today. Let's see. We'll bring Mr. Josh back. Hey, Mr. Josh. So I thought this was interesting. They talked to us about the telegraph, and I was trying to call a few students because I was wondering the telegraph, what the telegraph might have been. I mean, we have this prefix tele, right? We have this prefix tele, which gives us a clue, and then it says it helped people to communicate with businesses and it connected people. It sounds like it was a pretty big invention here. What do you think the telegraph? What do you think the telegraph was?
Yeah, so I don't know if we talked about it right before we left or
We did not actually. We didn't get
once
to
we started.
Can I get to it?
But there was this thing called the Pony Express, which sent mail and letters from St. Louis and the edge of the United States to other areas. And this took about a week to a week and a half. So this is pretty slow. But then someone came up with the idea that you could send information or you could send words over electricity. You would use this device and you would tap it. And depending on how you tapped, it would make a letter. So there would be a code that you would send and people would translate it, and that's how you would send messages. And if you wanted to send a letter or you wanted to trade, if you wanted to make some money, if you sent that information by mail, that could take 10 days. By the time someone reads it, by the time someone gets that letter, it might not be useful. The time might have passed when you could use that information. But if you use the telegraph, it takes less than half a minute. It takes 10 seconds to send that message from California to St. Louis. So you cut down on the time, and it makes it much easier to talk to people.
So as a result, the speed at which expansion could take place west exponentially grew, according to a few inventions, the telegraph being one of them, right? So now when I go out west, I can communicate back east where we have resources, what resources are available, what things we may need, where there are hostilities with Native Americans. I can report all these things that were not possible until now. So we talked a little bit about the railroad. So now we have an intercontinental railroad that was eventually built that took people all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. This wasn't built immediately, but this was built later. Hopefully we get to talk about it. So we have this railroad that can now transport people, resources, and goods. And not only that, but now I can communicate with you instantaneously. I can't iterate enough how revolutionary this was. This is why it took, let's say, the first 150 years in America to populate the East Coast, and it took maybe 50 years to really take over the entire western part of the continent, because you now have these technologies that allow you to communicate and move things at a rapid pace. There were other devices we'll talk about, like the advent of the windmill. We already talked about the cotton gin, how that sped up cotton production. So imagine today the equivalent of, like, my parents grew up without cell phones, right? Imagine if you guys didn't have cell phones. That is how revolutionary this telegraph was to American society. It was as revolutionary as us going from not having cell phones to having cell phones. And I would make the argument that the telegraph was the first iteration of the cell phone. It was the first thing that allowed us to start thinking about technology that allowed people to communicate when they're not in the same place.
Yeah, I would say that the telegraph is as important as the internet to us. So if we think about Wi-Fi, if we think about all of the social media that we use, watching stuff on YouTube, using other apps and texting each other, all of that, how important that is for what we do, that was the telegraph back then. You could send messages, you could get information, you could communicate with your family, get the weather. If you were trading, as Mr. Pugh does occasionally, you could use stocks with that. You could make sure that you got the resources that you needed for your town so that people got their medicine, so that they got their food. This really made it easier and better to live in these areas. And because of that, more people started to move because they realized, oh, I can do this now too. I have the ability, I have the skills to survive with the help of the telegraph, with the help of the windmill and the railroad and these other things that were developed back then. So more and more people started to move out.
Yeah. All right, so let's start this section, Mr. Josh, on the Transcontinental Railroad. We'll pick up here next class, so I know we're not going to finish. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act chartered the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroad companies, tasking them with the building of transcontinental railroad that would link the United States from east to west. Over the next 7 years, the two companies would race towards each other from Sacramento, California, on the side to Omaha, Nebraska on the other, struggling against great risk before they met at Promontory, Utah on May 10th, 1869. Okay. So we essentially have two companies that are created with the support of the government, one starting on the West Coast, one starting on the East Coast, and they're going to begin building a railroad to meet in the middle. So it's going to link the middle of the country with the West Coast of the country. There's some important things to note here. One of the important things to note is one of the most critical groups in building this railroad were Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, so on and so forth. This is where we saw a lot of Asian people coming to America and working on this railroad. We also have to understand that the transporting of goods this quickly, as well as people, had never happened before in the history of the United States. I also want you guys to know that we still move a lot of our supplies via railroad. We still have railroad companies under different names now that I believe it's called Union Pacific now, but we still have a railroad company that moves goods back and forth across the country using some of these railroads. It's really incredible. Mr. Josh, I like the fact that you pulled this up. It shows on the west, we see the Union Pacific, and on the right, we see the, we see the Central Pacific on the right, and I believe the Union Pacific on the left. Union Pacific on the right, Central Pacific on the left. Sorry, guys, I'm blind.
But yeah, this was super important because to go the distance from the Bay Area, from San Francisco to Omaha in Nebraska by horse or by carriage, that could take 2 months. That could take 3 months. By railroad, it could take a week, 8-9 days. So you've now just made it so much easier to move people, to move supplies over to these western areas, which made it much, much easier for people to set up communities there and to start new lives, make new jobs, try to make money out here. So as the railroads expanded, more people started to come out, just as they did with the telegraph.
All right. Let me show you guys an image here. I actually visited Sacramento last summer. I have a good friend out there. And this is like their old town Sacramento. This is a part of it. And they try to preserve it as best as possible. So this railroad ran right through a town being built on the West Coast, Sacramento. Okay? And this is kind of part of what it looks like here. So I want you guys to understand that the stops along this railroad were going to be major city centers, right? Nebraska was a major city center, right? You weren't going to stop it in the middle of nowhere. They were going to be a central place where people could come and trade goods. And it changed trade because now what I would do is I would go to Omaha or I would go to Sacramento to trade my goods to be shipped across the country. And this is the first time that if I'm in the East, I can get supplies and goods from the West. So we started sharing these different things with one another as a result.
Yeah, exactly. So before cars were a thing, 1920, 1930, so a while from when we're talking, all of these communities, you needed to be close to a railroad. You needed to be close to where you could get your supplies, your mail, where people could go, exactly. So they needed to stick close to these areas. So if you look at maps of the West, a lot of the big communities, Phoenix, Albuquerque, San Francisco, Boulder, Colorado Springs, whatever the capital of Utah is, don't know. I think it's Salt Lake City. All of these areas, all of these cities sprouted up around the railroad. So wherever the tracks were laid, that's where people lived. The railroad went first, and then people moved behind it.
Right. Now, Mr. Josh, I think this is interesting because we know that people live close to water sources prior to this. And the reason being is because you needed to be close to a source where you can move, right? And we were moving using boats prior to the locomotive being built, right? So you either move by land, or if you need to go far, you might take a boat and go around, right? So this changed, I think, the way in which people live and the places in which people live. Because now, if I have a railroad, I can get supplies in a place that I may not have otherwise been able to get supplies in. And that's an important thing for you guys to remember and note when we're talking about the migrations and the patterns of people living. The other interesting thing is the further you go west, the more scarce you see the population get, right? Like we see these major populations on the East Coast and West Coast, but we have these like cities at random, it seems, as we go through the middle of the country, because people had to, like you said, Mr. Josh, huddle in these urban centers because there just wasn't as much civilization. Let me see if I can pull a map up here. All right, guys, and we're almost done. We have like 4 minutes left. So if you have any questions, drop them in there. I want you guys to drop questions in. Me and Mr. Josh are looking at a map here so we can show you guys what we're talking about. All right, there
So
we go.
if we
Sure.
look, this is the population density of the United States. The darker the color is for the area, it means that more people live there. So if we look at the East Coast, if we look at Washington, D.C., we look at New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, we see a lot of dark red. If we look at Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, all of these other cities, we see Georgia down here, we see Miami, Fort Lauderdale. We see a lot of people live in these areas. But as we move out west, it gets much lighter until we hit Boulder, Salt Lake City, until you hit the capitals of these states.
Yep.
Not a lot of people live out here.
Yep.
And that's because they had to follow the railroads.
Yep. And I want you guys to take a look at this map. Once again, I'm pulling up a map of major cities. You see all these clusters of major cities here on the East Coast. You see Dover, Richmond, Annapolis, Baltimore, right? All these areas, right? You see all these dots. Now, when you go out to the middle, you see maybe one dot per state. So you have one really populated city in each state out west, and the rest of it is not very highly populated. And it's like that to this day. And that has electoral college implications. We talked about that. But we wanted you guys to see what was going on. And like Mr. Josh said, you either had to be on a river or you had to be on this railroad, or else there was no way that you were going to be able to live and survive. You couldn't formulate any sort of population unless you had a railroad or you had a river running through your town.
Yeah. Someone asked in the chat, how many people did it take to build the railroad? So because there wasn't a total number, we really don't know how many people, but we can take very good guesses based off of how many people they were paying, how many people that sadly died working on these things. And from our best guesses, it took tens of thousands of people to build the railroad coming out from Nebraska west and from California east. So you had tens of thousands of people working on this at the same time. Long days, bad conditions. People were not getting paid a lot. They were being treated very poorly. So sadly, a lot of them died while working because of these bad conditions. And when one person died, more people came and took their place because people were desperate to work. They were desperate to make that money.
Correct. And last thing I'm gonna say before I know you guys got to go, the people who were working on these railroads were not people who were of means, right? These were poor people who had no other choice. We see the same thing today with some people who work jobs that are not as desirable because there are no other opportunities available. So these were people who were poor and had no other opportunity other than to work there. And unfortunately, a lot of the conditions that they were subjected to, a lot of the ways in which they were treated wasn't the best because nobody was really supporting them or representing them. We didn't see unions in the country until later. So I want you guys to keep in mind what groups of people are having to do the hard labor, the labor in the fields, free labor with slavery, right? We see these railroads, the poor, immigrants, Irish, Asian Americans. Keep that in mind, guys. All right, thank you guys for coming and participating. We'll see you guys on Thursday. Some of you guys have been DMing me your work and all that good stuff. Keep doing that or turn it into the school. Feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do to help. Once again, everybody's getting credit for being on here. We're boosting grades, extra credit coming. See you guys later.